You're listening to Seek Travel Ride, a podcast all about taking incredible bike adventures. And if you love the conversations that you hear on the podcast, you can experience them live. Join me in London on May 14 and 15 for Beyond the Bike. It's going to be a special night of adventure cycling stories, bike adventure film screenings, and a live Q&A with a panel of previous podcast guests. Tickets are on sale now. They will sell out fast. So make sure to grab yours at the link in the podcast show notes in your podcast player app. Today's show sponsor is Old Man Mountain. If you're into bike adventures, you need to strap gear on your bike. Old Man Mountain have the right equipment to get you there on your bike travel journey. Check out their new product line, Hemlock Bag with Flip Cages. Check them out at oldmanmountain.com. Support the brands that support the podcast. And now, let's listen to today's episode.
There was a big question mark. And frankly, the uncertainty of it, the counting the days up, not counting them down, was the hardest aspect. I do think that having done long stints of relatively solitary time, when cycling, for example, and done a lot of things that are very hard, this didn't have a physical aspect to it. This was a mental challenge. But having done things that are physically and mentally hard over the years, I'm sure helped to toughen me up. By relativity, if I had come straight out of uni and then been thrown into this Russian prison, I'm sure that would have been significantly harder than it was, given that I had hopefully built some resilience over the previous decade or so.
Welcome to Seek Travel Ride, where we share the stories and experiences of people taking amazing adventures by bike, whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents. We want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello listeners, I'm your host Bella Malloy, and it's fair to say I'm pretty excited to be introducing my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Charlie Walker. Charlie is a true adventurer in every sense of the word, and he's explored some of the most remote and challenging places on Earth. His adventure CV is impressive, spanning across more than a decade, and at the very top of it is his 43,000-mile cycle tour. It was a 4.5-year journey which took Charlie to the furthest points, north, south, east and west, of Europe, Asia and Africa. A tour which was life-informing as well as life-changing, and which also saw him take on various side quests along the way. By the end of this journey, he could reflect back on also walking through the Gobi Desert, trekking through Mongolia on horseback, and paddling 350 miles down a tributary of the Congo River. My mind boggles at the experiences Charlie had during this period, sometimes with company, but often alone with his own thoughts, experiencing every emotion from elation to fear, loneliness, pride, exhaustion, and everything in between. Charlie documented his experiences from that journey in 2 fabulous books, and has also continued taking expeditions which would test his physical and emotional limits. His expeditions are born out of curiosity and a desire to understand the world in its rawest form. To be able to learn about and connect deeply with those living in remote indigenous communities, observing their culture, and then documenting their stories is something Charlie is especially passionate about. In 2017, he embarked on an 8,000-mile triathlon, tracking the perceived border between Europe and Asia. He followed this up in 2019 with a 2-month expedition crossing the highest peaks of Papua New Guinea. In 2022, Charlie was on another expedition, trekking through the Siberian Arctic. While there, the war between Ukraine and Russia broke out. A few weeks later, Charlie was locked up in a Siberian detention centre where he was held for 4 weeks before being released back to the UK. Now, incredibly, this event hasn't deterred Charlie from seeking out more expeditions, and in 2024, he returned to West Africa to cycle a leg of that original 4-year bike journey, which, due to the Ebola outbreak, had become impossible to do 10 years earlier. So, listeners, as you can see, Charlie's tested his limits in some of the toughest environments, and I am certain we're all going to be taken on quite the adventure of our own today as we learn more about his experiences. Charlie Walker, a big warm welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you.
I'm super chuffed, Charlie. When I set my questions up for you, I was like, wow, what an absolute privilege to be able to ask questions and hear answers on these type of topics. I do have a long list of questions, but Charlie, the question I have for you, and it's the first one, and I ask this of all my guests, is, Charlie Walker, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
Yes. My parents, I'm one of 4 kids. Yeah, my parents, I think probably before I was born, bought 2 matching kids' bicycles with wheels the size of small dinner plates. And they were red and blue. And I think I have quite strong memories, possibly informed by having seen photos of this, but of my dad sort of pushing me along, holding my shoulders. I don't think we did stabilizers. We learned to ride on an uneven, grassy garden, which isn't that easy. And sort of just supporting our shoulders on either side to, try and keep us upright. And the first time it sort of clicked, that moment when a kid first actually oh, look, mum, no hands. Although you're using your hands, of course. My dad sort of let go and I sort of pedaled on. I must have been 3, something like that. And came to the sort of the crest of a very gentle hill in the garden, at the bottom of which was a stone arch. This is a sort of old farmhouse down in the southwest of England. And my aim wasn't very good because I didn't go through the 1.5 meter wide arch. I just went into one side of it. So that was my very first bike ride.
Oh, I always try and get a feel for when someone's telling me this story about the things that they remember, because it gives me an insight into how they remember things that happen later on.
What's remembered and what are you remembering memories of?
Yeah, but also a little context there. And there were things there when you were talking about, learning on a rough path, no stabilizers, having to keep your balance. It was a bit of rough terrain. And I know it sounds really silly maybe, but I was thinking, gosh, you've been on some pretty rough terrain trying to keep your balance, whether on a bike or on footstep or on tiny horseback. From what I understand, Charlie, it's not like you grew up with a childhood where, you were out there seeking adventure in the outdoors all the time either. It's not that you didn't love the outdoors, but you wouldn't say that you were an outdoor adventurer growing up in your childhood either, would you?
No, not at all. I mean, we were, in the very literal sense, outdoors. We grew up in a small village and, in the school holidays, it was very much, out the door, we'll see you at lunchtime, go. So we would just kind of run riot around the village and climb trees and steal eggs and throw apples at cars and, sort of a feral upbringing as opposed to a sort of an adventurous as opposed to an outdoor sports upbringing, I suppose. There was never any hiking or camping holidays or kayaking or family bike rides or anything like that. The furthest we would cycle was to the village shop to buy sugary sweets. So we didn't have any of that in our upbringing.
I often wonder what is the thing that pushes someone to seek that out when it wasn't something that just sort of seemed inherently part of their personality growing up. I read that something that sparked the idea of going and travelling far on a bike was actually you took a 2-week journey very early on and you rode a bike for 2 weeks, and it was during that time that you were like, oh, I could actually go quite a way with a bike. Maybe that's what I'll do. How did that first 2-week trip even come to being then?
Well, I got into travelling before I got into adventure travel. I took a year out between school and university. And backpacked around East and Southern Africa for a little while. And while doing that, I quickly got interested in the sort of frankly, the unremarkable places. I remember one particular day in Tanzania being in a bus station and asking, where's this bus going? And the guy said Singida, which is a town I'd never heard of. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So I got on a bus for 7 hours and got off at the other end in just a small, unremarkable junction town called Singida, and stayed there for a couple of days. It's in the sort of the middle-ish of North Tanzania. And after a couple of days of kind of just wandering around and chatting to people, I went back to the bus station and said, where's this bus going? And they said, this place. And so I just carried on south and then sort of continued with, after that, I guess, back onto broadly a slightly more trodden path just by the fates of the buses. But yeah, I suppose the off the beaten path places very quickly appealed to me. So throughout university, every summer I would save up whatever, pennies I could and go somewhere cheaply. And one year that involved a friend saying, hey, should we go trekking in Nepal? And in the end, 5 of us went as a group. It was definitely the biggest group I've ever travelled with. But we took bikes and we cycled, not far, maybe 5 days or something, to the end of the road from Kathmandu. And then from there, we hiked up through the forest onto the Everest base camp trail, got up to base camp, turned around, came back down and cycled back to Kathmandu. So in total, we probably cycled for 8 days or something like that. Really not far. It was monsoon season, so, not great timing. And the cycling, I got some sense of, that was great. I really enjoyed that cycling. I think it was, it helped that I was with friends, but it was the sense of being able to get on a bike, cycle, and then you just pick somewhere and camp and you have that place. The first night, I think we ended up having to camp in a village school because it was the only place with any level ground, and we had an audience of 300 people for several hours, which is, nowadays is quite wearing. Back then was quite novel as a sort of 19-year-old or 20-year-old who had never done that before. But then the next night we found some waterfall, tumbling down out of a cliff next to the road, and we camped there for the night, and no one passed in the night, and it was boiling hot in the night, so we all went and just sat in this sort of rock pool for several hours to cool down. And so that got a sense of cycling opened some sort of doors. A year after that, I think, I'd just left uni, and I had booked a flight to Beijing, and my return flight was from Ulaanbaatar, the Mongolian capital. And it wasn't the initial plan, but I decided sort of a couple months after booking that, that's about 1,000 miles. Why not take my bike? Flying bikes was a lot easier back then as well. Now it's a bit of an ordeal. But back then, as long as you get it in a box, then the plane would take it. So I took it to Beijing. I was quite injured when I flew to Beijing, which wasn't a great start. And then I broke my wrist when I arrived in Beijing, which didn't help.
Hang on. Broke your wrist, was like crashing off the bike, or?
It was sort of alcohol related.
Oh. Well, it does take us back to when you were travelling. Like, how old were you then? Like 21, 22 maybe?
I would have been 21 then.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
fresh out of uni.
Yeah.
So with a snapped quadricep muscle and a broken wrist, or recently broken wrist, I set off out of Beijing and spent 2 weeks that honestly I didn't particularly enjoy. 1,000 miles, about 500 miles a week. It was the middle of July, I think, and so really hot and humid in Beijing and just north of Beijing. And it's quite hilly as well, that part of China. And I wasn't, not only was I not fit for doing that, but I also was, trying to shrug off these 2 injuries. And it was slow and hard work. On the first night, there was an incredible sense of naivety here, or example of naivety. I was aware that when you cycle in heat or do exercise in heat, you sweat a lot and you lose lots of salts. And I was aware of the idea of sort of oral rehydration salts. This is 2009. I think it's probably fair to say that with regard to sports and sports nutrition and just, it was a much simpler world. When people went for a run back then, they would maybe put a hole in a black bin bag and put it over their head and, there weren't vests with multiple micro bottles.
No, we didn't have watches that told us our heart rate and what our resting heart rate was and all these other
you ran as long as you
stuff.
could be bothered, and then you turned around and came back. And someone says,
"How was your run?" You didn't have to upload it somewhere and get kudos.
Exactly. So, I was very naive to all this stuff, but I was aware that, at the end of that first day out of Beijing, I must have, I was pouring with sweat all day. And so I cooked some rice, and then I thought, with some salt. And then I thought, the water that I've cooked the rice in, that I've put salt in, I didn't have much water. I hadn't managed to find a good place to sort of fill up bottles before camping. That water is full of salt. So if I just mix some sugar into it, then that's like rehydration salts. And I drank that and then got horrendously ill in the middle of the night, terrible stomach cramps. It was so hot in my tent that I was sleeping naked. And I was camped next to some sort of compound. It's built up for a long distance outside of Beijing. There are 6 ring roads around Beijing. It's, it goes on and on and on. And in the middle of the night, sort of naked as the day I was born, squatting under some sort of tree, emptying my salted bowels, this security guard came around and fixed this torch on me. And I was there like some sort of feral creature in the night. Don't look at me. So that was my first night.
Just my initial thought, shitting through the eye of a needle probably at the time.
I'm sure that's in the Bible somewhere. Anyway, so I carried on. After a week roughly, I crossed the border into Mongolia. And then from that point onwards, I mean, the road, I don't know how far it's got by now, but the road is building further and further. It's probably reached the border by now, a tarmac road from the Mongolian capital. But back then there were about 450 miles of, so what's that, 600-700 kilometers perhaps, of just tracks, trails across the desert, tire tracks weaving and wiggling and, you know, crossing each other, just spanning off into the horizon. Hard work to cycle, you know, loose surface, but also quite hard to navigate. I had a compass and I was just making sure I followed and this is an old school compass, not just an app on my phone, and just trying to make sure it followed a roughly north-northwest direction. And yeah, it was hot. I was dehydrated at 1 or 2 points. I remember one point definitely hitting a hard patch of sand or a soft patch of sand and coming over my handlebars and landing on my wrist that I'd recently broken. And I'm pretty sure sort of, you know, broke it again or you know, set the healing back a long way. So I got to Ulaanbaatar feeling, you know, knackered and relieved to have finished. And now I look back at that and I realise, oh, that's type 2 fun, which is great. Yeah, I'm sure your listeners will probably be aware of the types of fun.
Definitely, I am as well. I've often got a theory. I wonder how long it takes for the rose-tinted glasses for type 2 fun to sort of sink into us as well.
Oh, it took about a week back then, I think.
Because it is that thing, like, it's absolutely miserable at the time, and yet that's what we crave as well. I interviewed someone recently, Tristan Ridley, who, similar to yourself, Charlie, has spent quite a significant part of the last decade now, you know, travelling around the world, and he actually thinks it's actually a inherent personality trait in people who seek these type of things out.
Let's call it a defect.
Yeah. There's something in the suffering that we obviously take pleasure in some way. And also, there's part of us that have this handy memory loss, which allows us to go and do similarly miserable things at the time again.
Well, I think the rose tinting, I think, is part of once the trauma has been filed away and doesn't still feel particularly present, then it is it's a growth experience, to sound cliche. And I actually think that we're more able to view it that way because there is no cultural taboo with having, with rose tinting that sort of experience. There are many things, or certainly some things. I mean, I'm aware of cancer survivors who look back, eventually having survived, with, you know, in some sense, relatively fondly at the time where they faced such adversity, and obviously on scales entirely different to what we're talking about here. But they realized that they had this one simplified target: just survive, get through this chemo, you know, maintain my life. And they look back at that with some element of fondness. A better example is people look back at wartime. The greatest generation in the UK were forever going on about what a great time of like solidarity the Blitz was in London, or the war in general. And once the immediate sense, once the visceral sense of trauma from a negative or difficult experience fades a little bit from the forefront of the memory, then we start to look for, and arguably sometimes re-engineer, the positives from that experience.
Yeah, I wonder if there's an element of being able to be proud as well, because there is an element where in certain cultures, definitely in Australia, I would say definitely for Britain, the UK culture as well, it's not really encouraged for us to be proud of ourselves and to talk things up and say, look how good I am, I did this.
It's actively discouraged, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of... We have an acronym in Australia called FIGJAM, which I won't translate here, but it pretty much is exactly that. It's sort of, you know, don't be that person. But there is an element where you were saying earlier on, like, it is something where you can say, I suffered through that and I got through it. And it is the time where you can actually sort of be proud of getting through something as well. And I wonder whether there's an element of that too. It's interesting because the other thing that you mentioned there, which totally makes sense, is, and you talk about this in your book, you weren't seeking out a straight line route. You had this idea where you were going to take this journey and it was going to tick off the furthest points, north, south, east and west of, you know, Europe, Asia and Africa. But it was by no means going to be the most direct routes there. That was the case from day one. I don't think you came to that decision of making it, like I don't think you set off with the decision of trying to get there the fastest way possible and the most direct way possible. Or did you?
No, absolutely not. But by design, it was an arbitrary route, frankly. The idea was to get from the UK back to the UK via the furthest away place, the furthest away single place in each of those three continents. So the top of Norway, Singapore, and then Cape Agulhas down in South Africa. And I was never going to be breaking or setting any records. So what I did really didn't matter, at least to anyone except me. But what it was is something that would take me, it was something I could focus on, something I could, point my wheel at to the far side of, the world's biggest landmass, and then just keep going. And I knew there'd be all sorts of things along the way. And also the geography of, it's very interesting watching how the general direction of cycle tours changes over the years as countries sort of drop in and out of the kind of global democratic community, let's say, or as wars kick off. I mean, it used to be people go down East Africa, but now they don't, because Sudan, Ethiopia, and everyone's going down West Africa, which back then you didn't, because of Congo, because of, the legacy of various civil wars in the last 20 years. But even now, it only takes one more country to drop off. And, if I had to guess, I'd say it might be, Guinea, for example, because Guinea is a chokehold. It connects Mali, which is basically off limits, with the Atlantic Ocean. There's no other way through. So as soon as you have some sudden roadblock like that, people have to fly over, find another way around. Russia is another equivalent with trying to get across Eurasia. Everyone used to think, oh, maybe I'll go over the top of the Caspian Sea. Now, I'm sure right now, at this minute, there will be at least half a dozen long-distance cyclists waiting in Baku for some sort of ferry that feels like it will never come to get them across to Kazakhstan.
Yeah, and like Turkmenistan's been closed for ages as well. I think Iran is, political climate at the moment as well is forever changing. So, and that whole area, like people heading east and west to do the typical Central Asian route, it's not as straightforward as it used to be by any measure.
No. But it was always complicated at different times, I think. And in the past, I think that was more so due to visas. And I think broadly speaking, visa logistics have got easier with the passage of time. E-visas, for example. Also the fact that Central Asia has, and it was in the process of happening when I first cycled through there, but started to open up. You used to need all sorts of letters of invitations to get to Uzbekistan. And now Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, possibly Uzbekistan and Tajikistan as well are essentially visa-free countries for a limited amount of time. That definitely wasn't the case before. I'm not 100% up to date on that, so check before you fly. But now, sadly, what's, sort of the roadblocks are largely due to conflicts and the danger of essentially state-sanctioned kidnapping. A British couple, motorcyclists, were arrested in Iran, and they've been charged with espionage. And I suspect they'll be there for a while. And I suspect the Iranians have got them because they want to swap them for some sort of, Iranian prisoner in the UK or elsewhere. But the British government has a policy of not exchanging, not sort of engaging in hostage diplomacy. So who knows what will happen there. Anyway, sorry, we're off topic.
To be fair, I figured we would jump around a bit, but, that story there, it takes me right to your situation that I spoke to in my intro in Russia, in Siberia, because thoughts of that must have been racing through your head when you find yourself in a Siberian prison cell for 4 weeks. And if I recall correctly, wasn't there a thought that the charge for you was that you were a journalist on a tourist visa?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is... I'd been taken to court in Russia before, several years earlier, for a visa infraction. Back then it was committing tourism whilst on a business visa.
Such is your adventure CV. You've had this previous experience.
Yeah. I've been taken to court in Russia 3 or 4 times now.
There you go. Oh, just that old thing.
Well, one technically wasn't in Russia. It was in South Ossetia, which is a illegally annexed part of Georgia, but the Russians very much think of it as Russia.
Listeners, I don't know about you, but one of the best things about going on a bike adventure is being fully immersed in the ride. The only thing that you're listening to is the sound of nature all around you. But nothing kills that experience faster than gear which just annoyingly rattles, shifts around, or fails when the weather turns bad. That's why I'm super excited about our show sponsor, Old Man Mountain's new Hemlock bags. They are 100% waterproof. They're going to get you through the worst of the weather. They're ultra durable and totally secure. And best of all, when they're locked in place, they are silent. That's right. No rattling, no slipping, Just silent reliability, which is what you want for your bike adventure. Ride with gear that's reliably built for your adventures. Check them out at our bespoke link, oldmanmountain.com/seek travel ride, and support the brands that support the podcast. Now, back to the episode.
Anyway, yeah, the visa thing, so that there's always a reason that you're doing something wrong in Russia. You know, if the authorities take against you or decide you're an inconvenience, then they will find some sort of reason. So they claimed that I was conducting journalism, or whether I was or wasn't, I suppose is a fair argument in that, I mean, I am not a journalist. I'm a travel writer, and I was not there interviewing people with regards to journalism or anything like that. I was on an adventure journey, hiking along a frozen river to try and reach indigenous groups of reindeer herders, pony breeders, fur trappers, etc., to just kind of see their lives, very much in the way that a package tour to visit the Sami reindeer herders in Finnish Lapland, would do. And, if you're on a tour going up there, of course you're not a journalist, you're someone who wants to see this thing. The fact that I, intended to write a book about that part of Russia when I got back is, I think, neither here nor there. Anyway, the journalism thing, there's a debate to be had about that if you choose to be extraordinarily generous to the Russian authorities. The other things that they pinned on me were asking provocative questions about the special military operation. You can't call it a war there, of course. And that pertains to this day. You can't call it a war. People do, but if they're part of the regime, that's fine. If they are a normal person or a dissident, then, prison. And then most worryingly of all, they said that I'd been photographing restricted military sites. Now, looping back to, it doesn't matter, they'll always find something on you. They never asked to see my phone or my camera, and they said I've been photographing restricted military sites. They never produced any photos to prove that. They then had my phone and my camera in their custody for a month, and then didn't make me delete any pictures before leaving the country. So, obviously that was a lie. The witnesses that they, had to sort of testify against me, one of them I hadn't met. So who said, yes, no, he was asking me about Ukraine. So they just found some people and coerced them into lying, I think. So it didn't really matter. They decided that I was, to be found guilty, and so I was. 99.75% of defendants in Russian cases that go to trial are found guilty. So 1 in 400 are released. Amusingly, the rate of people acquitted was slightly higher during the Stalinist era. But
that's saying something. Whoa.
Well, back then they didn't really bother with the due process. They just threw you in the gulag anyway.
Yeah, or you were buried in the road of bones or something.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I was found guilty, but I was tried on an administrative charge, so not a criminal charge. So an administrative charge is like a different order of offence. Although certainly the latter two offences they had charged me with could very easily be applied to a criminal charge. Essentially conducting fake news journalism about the war, asking provocative questions, and spying, espionage, photographing military sites. My punishment was to be banned from Russia for 5 years. So 2 years left and I can go back. I'm not sure if I will be rushing straight in.
I was going to say, is there part of you that wants to scratch that itch and actually go on the expedition that you had planned?
Well, I mean, I did the expedition.
Oh, I thought you were part way through when this all happened.
No, I'd marched into my finish point. Yeah, so I had 2 months.
How did I miss that? Sorry, that's my own
question.
question.
We didn't focus on that so much in a lot of the coverage, I guess. But I'd had 2 months out hiking. I'd met the Eveni reindeer herders. This picture behind me, that's camping on the sea ice with northern lights. It was really beautiful.
It's a brilliant photo, listeners. I hope I can share something like that with you. And actually, while I'm just looking at your photo board, I can see Namibia there as well. I'm seeing someone from Papua New Guinea perhaps above your head.
Yes.
And is that a map? Is that a route map of the route that you took, that whole big journey?
Yeah, someone very kindly, someone I'd known when I was younger, turned up at my sort of homecoming party, and he has since I knew him, has become a cartographer, and he just turned up with this beautiful map of my entire route and various kind of pivotal points marked on it.
What a gift!
Yeah, really, really nice. But anyway, where are we? We're in Siberia.
You finished your expedition.
Yes, exactly. So I was charged with this administrative offence, banned from Russia for 5 years, to answer your question, I would love to go back to Russia. I just have to wait for regime change, which will happen in our lifetime, but it might be quite late in our lifetime. We'll see. There might be a global war to get through first. Who knows? Different conversation. Banned from Russia for 5 years, a fine of 5,000 rubles, which is about £50. So not much.
Not bankrupting you.
Not the biggest fine I've had from a Russian court before.
How many people can say this? Oh, it's not the biggest one I had from the court before. You're talking about it almost like it's a parking fine.
Sadly, loads of people in Russia can say that.
Oh.
And then the third point was deportation, which initially I took because there wasn't sort of adequate translation in court. Initially, I took to be I was led to believe that I would take a flight the following day, which I already had, back to Yakutsk, the regional capital. This is all unfolding in a tiny port town on the north, on the Arctic coast of Russia, so about 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle.
And time of year here as well, like you were there. This expedition was also, from my understanding, it was also documenting the change that was happening because of like environmental change.
That was the plan, yeah.
Like this is the coldest part of the world, literally.
Coldest inhabited place on Earth, yeah. So I started in late February, and the coldest temperature I had, the coldest I saw my thermometer inside my tent was minus 49 centigrade. Fahrenheit, that would be minus 60 something, I guess. So yeah, really, really cold. But so I thought I'd be able to fly from Tixi, this port town, down to Yakutsk on the flight I already had, and then just get myself on the first flight out of Russia, which was fine. I was sort of anticipating doing that anyway. By this point, the war had been going on for 2 months. I'd felt increasingly, I guess, sort of exposed and frankly out of my depth being in Russia while the kind of civil liberties were, disappearing, and the all-encompassing nature of the war was ramping up. I was 5,000 kilometers from the front lines, the very far. If you go to Beijing, go about 3,000 kilometers north and another 2,000 kilometers east. That's where I was. Just way up in the middle of nowhere, east of North Korea. Same time zone as Brisbane. Same time zone you're in now, I believe. And yeah, but it turns out when I got to I was accompanied on my flight by a bailiff down to Yakutsk, the regional capital, which, had sort of surprised me, but I thought maybe he's going anyway. I don't really know. I wasn't cuffed or anything like that. But then on arrival in Yakutsk, I was collected by another bailiff and taken to this detention center, this prison, and locked up. And they said, we will deport you. The state will deport you. The state will arrange your deportation flights. But we don't know when it is, so just stay put. So I was just in this cell day after day, not knowing, if it's the last day or if this is just the beginning of a really long process. I was told it could be, it could be a few days, it could be 10 days, it could be a few months. There was a big question mark. And frankly, the uncertainty of it, the counting the days up, not counting them down, was the hardest aspect. I do think that having done long stints of relatively solitary time, when cycling, for example, and done a lot of things that are very hard, this didn't have a physical aspect to it. This was a mental challenge. But having done things that are physically and mentally hard over the years, I'm sure helped to toughen me up. By relativity, if I had come straight out of uni and then been thrown into this Russian prison, I'm sure that would have been significantly harder than it was, given that I had hopefully built some resilience over the previous decade or so. In the end, thankfully, after 4 weeks, they deported me, which was a huge relief, because the longer I was there, the more I thought they're probably just going to take me back to court and retry me and then keep me as and this is relating back to how we got onto this topic, as a bargaining chip, as a prisoner for a prisoner swap. Brittany Griner, the American basketball player, was in prison in Moscow at the time, unbeknownst to me. And since then, it's been striking to see, what happened to the now thankfully released Evan Gershkovich, who he was tried with espionage, but he was a journalist on the correct visa, just doing his job. But it seemed very easy that they could have, swung they could do whatever they want there. There is no due process. There is the illusion of due process.
Yeah, and like you're in their hands, literally. Like they can do with you what you want. And you're alive for as long as you're useful to them in that sort of bargaining aspect of it. And I imagine that would have played on your mind. When I knew I was interviewing you, it did occur to me that a lot of the things that you had, I guess, the right word or not to say, but the things that you had endured on previous journeys, building up that bucket of mental resilience, would have had to have only been beneficial for you.
Definitely.
I'm sure there were moments where it would have still been hell in your mind. And I was wondering, there's this notion of post-adventure blues. When a big journey or an expedition, whether it's 5 years, whether it's 5 weeks, whatever, whenever something that you have anticipated for so long, you've gone, you've done the thing, you've had the experience, and then you're back and it's over, and post-adventure blues hits not everybody, but a fair amount of people. And I imagine you know what I'm talking about there. Did you find after the Russian experience, was that different to how you had felt at previous endings of other expeditions?
It's a really good question. And I'm fascinated in the concept of post-adventure blues. In fact, just yesterday, I read a relatively long sort of newsletter, blog post from Al Humphreys on the topic. Al did a 4-year journey, in many ways similar to my 4-year bicycle journey, but about a decade earlier. And actually going back to the shifting geopolitics, he was on his way across Europe when
September 11 happened.
Exactly, 9/11. So he no longer could go through Iran and the Middle East, so turned right and went down through Africa instead. But so he wrote about it, and he included in his newsletter a bunch of links to, I think his newsletter is called The Working Adventurer. It's worth checking out for anyone who's into this.
I've spoken about this with Al. I've spoken about it because I interviewed Al a couple of months ago. When I was talking about it with Al, we were talking about post-adventure blues, and he had mentioned in the podcast, someone should really write a book about that. And I was editing the episode, and I guess I'm putting it out there now, and sometimes saying it out loud, but I've taken it on as my project to do.
Great. That's a really good idea.
Tag teaming with Al on post-adventure blues a bit, and obviously I've interviewed many people who have had to deal with this as well. But it is an interesting thing. But if we go back to how you felt after, how did you feel then with that? Did you notice there was a difference with Russia, with that whole experience, as opposed to, say, trekking through PNG or, some of those other journeys that you had done?
Controversially, and I suppose to entirely write myself out of any input to your book.
That's fine.
As far as I'm aware, I've never really experienced post-adventure blues. As far as I'm aware, and maybe it's just that I haven't lent that much thought to it. I'm not entirely sure. My big long journey, I was away from home for 4.5 years, and by the time I got back, I was ready to get back, and I just wanted normality. I wanted friends, and I think Al talks about the holy trinity of cold beer, hot shower, and soft bed or warm bed or whatever it might be. And I was really excited about all that, and having just normality for a while, having friends, getting drunk, being silly, that kind of thing. And I was quite ill for the last 6 months of that journey. My health was I got quite ill in the Congo and never fully got back to normal health until I got home, when I very quickly did. And so I didn't really feel it there. And by the time I started to, the way I tend to view it is not so much as post-adventure blues, but itchy feet. Because I don't remember ever really feeling down about it. Maybe in 2 different ways. I've never been someone who particularly thinks long and hard about mental health, and I think that possibly is partially because I've been quite lucky in my life to not have any particular periods of struggling with that, and partially because I have a very repressed British upbringing where we, don't talk about that.
Very Victorian, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'll call it late Edwardian. But as long as I have something that I'm next thinking about or working towards, I think it's fine for me, as long as it doesn't feel like it's the end. And I guess I anticipate that one day I may well feel adventure blues if I come back from something and feel, I'm getting too old and rickety now or whatever. And, a sense of finality, that frightens me. Whereas to date, pretty much as soon as I get back from something, and actually, right now I am very recently back from something a couple of weeks ago and don't yet have something next, but I'm sure soon enough I will. As soon as I get back from something, the lovely delights of normal life are there, and you see friends, and also often really, really busy. Nowadays, when I'm trying to carve out some time to go and do something, if inquiries for work, speaking engagements or whatever come in, I always try and shepherd them to either side to carve out as big a space as possible. So often the days leading up to going away and the week or so after coming back are absolutely manic. And not only am I sort of sorting out every unanswered email from the last couple of months or whatever, I'm also perhaps driving around the UK or getting off to other parts of the world to give a presentation, and there's not really time to pontificate. So I'm not very well versed in the idea of post-adventure blues, but I find it really interesting because most people I know who do these sorts of things do experience them. And for me, as long as there's something to work towards, to look forward to, another journey, another project, whatever it might be, then that doesn't really seem to apply yet.
One of my theories is that I think part of it sometimes might be linked to a bit to identity and what you identify yourself as. And so if I take you as a case in point, you finish this big thing, but part of your identity is also as a storyteller and sharing your experiences. And so when you finish doing the physical thing, you are also then busy sharing about it. So in a way, it's not that it's sort of over, because it's sort of a continuation of it in a different light.
That's a very good point. I get to sort of continue to live in that space at certain points. Although because I do speak professionally, I go and talk to schools, conferences, festivals, whatever else. I'm very happy getting up on stage, telling a story. It doesn't matter if it's hundreds of people. That's never been a problem for me. And talking to someone on a podcast like this, where the remit is we're here to talk about this thing, absolutely fine. In social situations, I'm awful. Like I feel weirdly cagey about talking about these things. My wife is constantly having a go at me for seeming rude to her friends because they say, "Oh, how's your latest thing been?" "Oh, yeah, it's fine. So how are you? How's work?" And I instantly try and redirect the conversation and change the topic, because I don't know if it's because it feels solipsistic to wang on about myself, or it feels like a busman's holiday, too much like work. I don't really know, but I am weirdly cagey and introverted about that in social settings. When the remit is, or if it's a professional setting and we're here to do this and talk about this, absolutely fine. Because it feels like it's almost sanctioned to focus on myself for a bit, I guess. I don't know.
Do you know what that's reminded me of? Obviously, I knew I was interviewing you, Charlie, so I've reread your books. Actually, I listened to it, which is an experience, because you do all the accents and stuff as well.
Oh, let's not talk about accents. The second book, once I realised audiobooks are a challenge, I did a lot less dialogue.
But anyway, in your first book, and it's when you have arrived in Southeast Asia on what you classify as the Banana Pancake Trail.
Yes.
Big backpacking, sort of people in their early 20s having all sorts of fun.
Hedonism circuit.
Exactly. But I remember it was something that you had written about then. And it was this context of you were known as, that's the bike rider or the
bicycle guy or whatever.
That's bicycle guy. And you had found that you were sort of cowering to not really want to be proud about how far you had gone or what you were doing and all this. And this is sort of going back to what you're saying now in a way. Like, I don't want the spotlight on me for this. I don't want to tell you all these things. I sort of want to shrink back. Whereas you'd said in an earlier life, when you're a backpacker, you probably would have indulged that a bit more.
Yeah, I don't know exactly why that is. I mean, it's possibly something to do with spotlight. It's also maybe something to do with the exhaustion of explaining it and knowing that any second now, the question why do this is around the corner. And that's a question that, my first book was an 80,000 word attempt to answer that question. And by my own admission, inadequately, because you can't give an answer. You can give your thesis, but on any given day, if someone asks me that question, I've got, dozens of different answers, some of them flippant, some of them serious. And from day to day, I don't know which one it is, because there's not a simple answer to it. It's like asking what's the meaning of life. It can be a different thing to a different person on a different day. It's like you don't step into the same river twice. What do we got here? Heraclite and flux. There's not an answer to that, or not an adequate answer, but it's always just around the corner. When people ask you, what you're doing or how far, you cycled all the way to Laos from England, why? And I dread that.
Listeners, if you have ever tuned into this podcast and thought, wow, I'd really love to be in the same room with Bella and hear these conversations live, then you do not want to miss Beyond the Bike, a live Seek Travel Ride event happening in London on May 14th and 15th. That's right, 2 shows, 2 nights. Beyond the Bike is a collaboration between Seek Travel Ride and previous guest Jude Crywald, and we are going to be bringing you an incredible night full of bike adventure stories. Each night will feature a different panel of previous podcast guests. They're cycle tourers, bikepackers, ultra racers. They've gone long haul around the world, and they're going to be sharing real adventure stories, insights, and tips for taking on your own cycling journeys. We're also going to be having 2 film screenings. One of them is Jude Crywald's amazing Alone Across Gola film. Take it from me, it will blow your socks off. It is absolutely epic. And we're finishing the night off with a live audience Q&A where you can ask our panellists all your burning bike adventure questions. Grab your tickets now. I've put a link in the podcast show notes. Check it out in your podcast player app. Come to one night or come to both. Book your spots now. I cannot wait to see you there. But I also think, to be fair to yourself, and you probably have been, but I feel like you take a big journey like that and you change along the way. So your reasons change too. So what it would have been when you started would be totally different to what it was 6 months, 12 months, 1 year, 1.5, 3 years down the track as well. I often wonder, Charlie, do you ever reflect on sliding doors moments and think how that could have gone? Or if you'd never taken that journey in the first place, what would you be doing now? Or if on your way back through Iran, when you had that point where you were like, you know what, maybe this is where I just want to end it and I want to go straight back to the UK and I don't want to go down to Africa. Like, do you ever think about if I'd changed my decisions, I wonder what would have?
Funnily enough, I don't think I've ever considered that with regard to, if I had never gone on this journey, what would I be doing? I have thought about if I very nearly decided to not spend to do the final leg of my journey through Africa. When I was in Turkey, I was all but convinced. I had essentially decided to just cycle home. And at the, sort of a couple of days from the point where I would have had to actually make a turning in the road and decide, I had a good day and I thought, I don't want to throw all this in just because it's been tough at times. So I do consider about that, because I think if that had been the case, well, I don't know what I would have done is the answer, but I do occasionally wonder, would I be doing this for a living, or would I have gone home and got a quote unquote proper job and continue to do these things as and when I could, between times. I occasionally consider that, but I don't think I've really gone into to depth with it. It's like with the idea of regrets. I'm often asked, do you regret going to Siberia, given what happened? And I don't, and I can't, because there's sort of no point. I'm quite sort of coldly, pragmatically rational when it comes to these things. I could spend a long time going down that wormhole of what if I didn't, but then, there's a comedian I quite enjoy called Richard Herring who hates the film Sliding Doors because he says it's absurd, because every single decision we make in our lives is a inflection point where things could go off in radically different directions, and whether it happens to be and maybe that's the thesis of the film, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's an unfair critique of the film. I think he says he's just angry because John Hannah's character in that film quotes Monty Python, and that sort of seems to woo a woman, whereas he, a professional comedian, had been quoting Monty Python all his life, much to the chagrin of women in his life. So maybe it was just angst at that. But any single moment, if I hadn't broken my wrist on arrival in Beijing, maybe that ride to Mongolia would have been that much easier, and I wouldn't have thought about it so much afterwards. Or there's so many of those possible points. As soon as you start to think about them, it becomes almost a pointless exercise, to my mind. Not to undermine your question.
No. It's like when you were in Tibet and you were struggling up a mountain pass, and I think there was a farmer or a local, I'm not sure what I would call the man, but he was warning you, don't go there, it's not good, come stay here. And you're like, oh no, it's too early to stop, or I must go on. Had you accepted his hospitality at that point, would you have not endured to go out and be lost in a way? And I mean, Tibet would have still probably continued to happen, and extreme things would have happened to you there. But that was definitely the point. I think it was on that day where you had the, oh my gosh, I'm going to die moment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that was, I suppose what I take from that is not so much what would have happened if I didn't, but a lesson that I've often ignored since then, I suppose, to listen to, the advice of people who know. But so many, I mean, I remember when I set out from England, age 22, at the beginning of this odyssey, the second night I camped in the beer garden of a pub in Kent or Sussex, I forget which. And I was looking for somewhere to camp, and the sort of landlady said, "Oh, camp in the garden, no problem." And then some guys sitting at a table outside the pub said, "Well, where are you going on that bicycle?" And I said, "China." And it blew their minds. And then they just plied me with drink. I had 5 pints or something like that. And, passed out in this beer garden, woke up the next morning, nearly missed my ferry to France. But while I was chatting with them, they're like, "Oh, so where's next?" And I was like, "I'm getting on the ferry to France tomorrow." And they were like, "Oh, France, yeah, you don't want to go there." And then I was in France for about 2 hours, straight into Belgium. But in Belgium, people were saying, "Oh, those Dutch, they're crazy." And in the Netherlands, people were saying, "Oh, yeah, watch out for the Germans." And then the whole way around the world, I mean, it's not xenophobia, I suppose, it's just mistrust. Everyone thinks everywhere that isn't exactly where they are is not safe. A friend of mine, I mean, you may have interviewed him, Leon McCarran, also done a long bicycle ride.
Oh, I haven't, but now I want to.
He has a story about being in an airport queue in, I forget where he was, but there was a guy in front of him in the queue and a guy behind him in the queue, and they all got chatting. And the guy in front of him was from, I think, Iraq, and the guy behind him was from Afghanistan or Beirut, I forget exactly where. And they asked him where he's from, and he said, "Oh, I'm from Northern Ireland." They said, "Oh my God, that in Northern Ireland, that must be so dangerous." And, they're from 2 active war zones. And so there is just this general sense that everywhere and everything is dangerous. And I've had this, wherever I've been in the world, people say, "Where are you going?" I go, "Oh, I'm going to kayak down this river." And they say, "Oh, well, don't go down there. The river's not safe." And I'll ask, "Well, have you been down there?" And they say, "No, but it's not safe." Because we tend to know our sphere, our area, and if we're lucky enough to live in stable times, we trust that sphere. But we have the belief, and this is probably born of human evolution, it's probably a useful belief to have from a self-preservation perspective. We have this belief that everything outside that sphere is dangerous, and that's why we stay where we are safe in our sphere. Quite how that relates to the fact that humans have been a migratory, in some broader sense, species for tens of thousands of years, fanning out across the world is interesting, and especially when you consider Polynesians setting off in a canoe into the open ocean in the hope of finding some island somewhere. And who knows the countless tens of thousands who never got to that island and drifted, never got anywhere. So it's that sort of tricky balance, to bring it back to your initial question, of trying to take advice or foreboding warnings with a pinch of salt, and yet at the same time trying to read between the lines and work out where is there, what can I actually take from this. When you throw into the mix linguistic difficulties, it gets even more blurred, and that was definitely the case with this man in Tibet 14 years ago.
Yeah, and also time, like in a context, we're talking about the time that you were there, and you were talking about changing geopolitical borders and all this sort of stuff, but we've also talked about tech, and I wondered, Charlie, how much has changed about the way that you do your expeditions now because of that.
This is such a good question.
It's not a case that you're accessing the internet in some dial-up cafe somewhere, or I mean, you are going to some extreme places where I imagine you don't have, 5G network and all this sort of stuff as well. Like, you do seek those sort of places out. But the world, in a way, was a bit smaller. And the access to what we can find out now is a bit more. Like, with West Africa, for example, that was a case where you missed a section in 2014. Yep. I think it was because Ebola had broken out.
Well, the borders closed. There was just no way through. Yeah.
If the borders weren't closed, would you have gone on?
That's a good question. Probably. I mean, would I now is probably a harder question to answer. But back then, I mean, I was fully intending to, I mean, the first border that was closed was the border between Nigeria and Cameroon. And that was closed by the Cameroonians because there have been 4 cases of Ebola, declared in Lagos, the other side of Nigeria anyway. So I definitely would have, if I'd been able to, carried on across that border at least. And there was quite a way to go. I mean, the epicenter was Guinea, which is really the far end of West Africa. That's thousands of kilometers away. So I guess I would have kept going until I couldn't, probably. But there was a... I don't think I've ever heard the phrase cordon sanitaire used in a literal sense, but there was a cordon sanitaire around the epicenter, and then borders further away started to close from a caution perspective. And then we saw this play out on a global scale with coronavirus more recently. I probably would have continued. But I mean, your question with technology, I've been thinking about this a lot in the last year. I did the first bit of that gap from Cameroon to Liberia, and then this year I went back and finished off Liberia to Dakar. And it was the first time I had cycle toured in the way that I had back in 2010 to 2014 since then. So in 10 years I'd been doing all sorts of other things, but quite different things that tended to be in places where a phone was not really much good anyway. You get out into the wilderness and then your phone is just a camera or a weight in your pocket until such time as you get to the end or whatever. So I hadn't really grappled with that idea of how things were changing outside of my context of being at home in the UK. I came back to the UK in 2014, having left in 2010, and the world had changed. You know, phones did everything, smartphones, apps ran everything. We had become, in the interim, entirely dependent, and that has now spread much, much further and sort of really throughout much of the developing world, not all. And on this journey in West Africa, I took a phone, and when I arrived in when I flew in, I got myself a SIM card because, I need a SIM card to get Google Maps because Google Maps is how I direct. But it didn't used to be. I used to have paper maps, or I would get on a computer in an internet cafe, which it turns out they don't really even exist anymore. I tried to not get a SIM card this year. I entered Sierra Leone and I was like, right, I'll be in this country for, I don't know, a week, 10 days, something like that. I won't get a SIM card. I didn't get one in Liberia. I don't need a SIM card. And I'll just go to an internet cafe, in a couple of days' time, so I can send a message to my wife saying everything's fine. And there weren't. I found the ghosts of internet cafes. I found ones that had been previously internet cafes people directed me to, and they had closed. So the old days of going to an internet cafe and drawing with pen on paper a crude map of the route ahead, that's gone. And
are you nostalgic about that? Like, do you wish that wasn't
really,
the case?
Really nostalgic. And actually, I think maybe a month ago, this is another thing that Al wrote a newsletter about, because he did his big journey 10 years before me, 9-10 years before me. And he was in the internet cafe age. He was, he had mini discs rather than an iPod, which I had. So, he had an even more limited, repertoire of things to listen to as and when he did while traveling.
He didn't let himself listen to music, though. He was like self-flagellation on that. And we spoke about that.
I think he says he listens to music. He listened to music when he was especially happy or especially sad.
Yeah. But that was even only like down at the end of the track. He would force himself not to because he had to suffer through it. Such an Al thing. I
have some of that as well. And, on in fact, all journeys, I don't really tend often to listen to music when I'm doing these things, but I do like to listen to podcasts. I think it gets them. Listening to music gives the mind space to roam, as does just silence. Listening to podcasts is a good time to just, chew over ideas that other people are bringing to you. But I'm quite strict about, I can have 1 hour of podcasts in the morning and 1 hour in the afternoon, something like that. Because I want to be present in my suffering.
You're out there to experience, yeah.
Exactly. But I'm trying to get back to where I jumped off here. Nostalgic
about the maps.
Yeah, I'm definitely nostalgic about it because there's so many things that these phones enable, and they are amazing, and with maps you are able to, while camping, for example, something I've never struggled with. I've developed quite a good eye for where, even if it's quite close to a settlement or a village, often I can hear people talking in the village. I might be just 30 yards away from houses and no one knows I'm there because you develop an eye for where people wouldn't look, or if you're in developed countries where people wouldn't walk a dog. It's always the dog walkers who would find you. But with a phone, with wild camping, you can literally look at a bird's eye view, a photo from space of where you are and find a hidden spot or a clump of trees or whatever. So and you can even see footpaths leading off the road to get to them. So it really helps things like that. It helps navigation. It helps find like-minded people. You can hop onto Facebook and find a Facebook group where a bike mechanic in sort of a small town in Ghana might be of use, for instance. It enables and facilitates all these things, which is amazing. But what it totally writes off is that sense of chance, that sense of feeling lost, that sense of not just the urge to, but the necessity to approach random people and ask for help or ask for their guidance, to ask for directions, opinions. So I feel like you get less immersed in where you are and more immersed in this thing in your hand. And I really miss the haphazard, stumbling, bumbling sense of how it used to be, where you're living on your wits more, you're living on other people's wits more, and it does feel like more of an adventure because it's less
known.
Yeah, exactly, and it's less organized. Travel in general has changed like that, not just cycle touring, but backpacking. No one's turning up somewhere without somewhere to stay. The days of roaming, from flea-bitten hostel to flea-bitten hostel, looking for a bed for the night, they're basically gone, unless you're part of the old school like me who doesn't understand that, because everywhere's booked out or whatever it might be, because people have just arranged their journey. They've booked their ticket on the bus. They've got, they'll get possibly even an Uber. Even in, the global south, they might get an Uber or an app taxi to get from the bus station to the hotel that they've already booked. They then know which restaurant in the area is well reviewed, so they can go to that one. And by doing that, you avoid eating crap food in crap places, but you also miss finding great food in crap places or whatever it might be. And the chance, the happenstance of travel has just, I think, without us noticing, bled out. And I mourn that.
I am totally 100% with you there. I'm not a planner. I might have a start and an end point to something that I do and a rough idea of maybe it'll take me this many days, but I don't ever want to be one of those people that goes, I must finish this day at this place and go to this place. And the whole point for me of traveling is that curiosity of, I want to know what I don't know about. I can't wait to see. I never knew this thing existed today. What a great place.
And to feel lost.
Yeah.
To feel pleasantly lost.
Yeah. I often get sense of humour failures when I'm lost.
but that's part of it as well, it shouldn't all be positive, I think.
I have a couple of great questions for you, and they're both sort of very linked to what we've just spoken about there now. And I'm gonna ask you them first. The first one's actually, you've sort of gone into it a little bit, but I'd like to hear your answer on this. And they're both listeners from previous guests. The first one, Charlie, is actually from Rob McLennan. And so this is what Rob has had to say to you. I'm going to play it through the microphone.
Okay.
Hey, Charlie. I've got a question for you. What was one thing that you noticed when cycling through West Africa 10 years on from your first trip that had changed dramatically over that time? And was there anything that hadn't changed that surprised you?
We've sort of talked a bit about the first part of the question, but what are your answers there?
Well, so the first part has to be phones, and that's not just the idea of having a phone myself and sort of fighting to not use it, to keep it in the bar bag and leave it there, but also with regard to people having phones, how that has drastically changed things. And then I suppose the second question I would give as a sort of corollary, I can never say that word, to my first answer.
No, corroborate?
Corollary, I think that's it.
Oh.
To my, as an addendum, let's say,
that's
to my
a better
first
word,
answer, which is that for the countries themselves, I felt like, although phones are changing things and people, everyone's using orange money or, they're transferring money with phones and whatever, it also in many ways really hasn't changed things. So West Africa, I found, compared to 10 years earlier, and obviously the point of me going back last year and this year was to visit the places that I hadn't visited 10 years earlier. So I have to caveat that. But I found that in many ways, it really hadn't changed. But I also traveled around the region, Guinea, Senegal, Mali, back in 2007. So nearly 20 years ago. And it had changed hugely from then in two ways. The first way that, along with the majority of the global south, the level of deprivation had slowly, receded. There isn't grinding poverty in, as far as I'm aware, in that part of the world in the same way that there was in 2007. People are better fed, people are better clothed, people are better sheltered. And that, I think, is a sign of just a huge rise of the sort of lower median living standard across the planet in that time. Sadly, with various political changes now and, USAID, for example, I wonder or fear if those sort of changes might be, at the very least, halted, if not reversed.
We feel like we're on a precipice on that.
Definitely, yeah. The other aspect is the kind of back to shifting geopolitics. Back in 2007, when I was in Mali was this beautiful, great country, and I travelled up country up to Timbuktu. Back then you could go even further up to Gao, and there were monuments made from the melted down guns taken in amnesties from Tuareg rebel fighters after various conflicts in the past. Those, this is a guess, it wouldn't surprise me if those monuments are now being melted down to make more weapons. But Islamist rebels have seized Mali. Mali is a very, very dangerous place now. The same goes for Burkina Faso, just to the south. There is a belt of nations that have sadly undergone or suffered coups, military coups, in the last few years. In fact, that belt reaches unbroken all the way from the Atlantic to the Indian, going through Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad. It goes all the way, and now Ethiopia at war. This unbroken chain of civil conflict. Back in 2007, the places that you were worried about visiting and advised not to visit were Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and to a lesser extent, Guinea, because they were countries that had all had recent civil conflict. Some of them still had elements of civil conflict, and there were hundreds of thousands of refugees kind of jostling for space, trying to find an existence in the liminal border regions of these countries, afraid to go back to their countries for fear of being accused of collaboration during the war, but unable to integrate into the country they were in, or unwelcome to integrate into the country. And while Sierra Leone, for example, is still in many ways, it's still definitely inarguably scarred and hugely set back by its horrific experiences at the turn of the century, it's on the up, and that country is rising. Cote d'Ivoire the same, Liberia, whereas other countries that perhaps are currently slightly more geopolitical playthings of maybe even of greater powers influencing them are becoming less and less stable. So just the whole checkerboard, chess board of the region has massively shifted. Quite a tangent on Rob's really good questions there, but that was the main thing I noticed that had changed, is the map of the region feels like it's changed in a sense.
My next question is totally different to that, but goes on to a point that we were talking about before, which was about being lost. This is a question from another previous guest, Jude Kryvold, and this is what he has to say.
Hey Charlie, really glad to see you got back from Gola Rainforest in West Africa, okay? I've got sort of a two-part question I'd love to ask you. First part was, what was it about that route through the Gola Rainforest that drew you towards it? What made you want to go there, having seen parts of it? And the second question, or the second half, was the GPS tracks you sent me afterwards. You showed me that actually you got a little bit lost at some point in the rainforest and went around in a few circles. I wanted to know what that was like. What was going through your mind at that time? How lost were you? What tools were you relying on? And what thoughts were going through your mind? Because I know it's a pretty isolated place when you're following the track or trying to follow the track, and when you're off the track, that must have been quite something. So I'd love to hear about that. Thanks, mate. All the best. Bye.
There we go.
Well, hi, Jude. Thanks for that question. I've touched base with Jude since I came back from Liberia. So what tempted me into that route in the first place was you, Jude.
And an incredible film too now. I don't know, have you seen it?
I have seen it. It's great. Really worth watching. Over pints in the Falcon pub in London, Jude convinced me that this route was a great thing to do. So I went to check it out. I was traveling a lot lighter than Jude, which made it less of an epic, I think, because I've listened to Jude's recounting of his experiences there on your podcast, and it was made, I think, particularly grueling by the fact that there are bridges that are out and there are trees that are down, so you've got to kind of get over them. And he had, I think, his bike and gear all in weighed about 50 kilograms, whereas I was probably more in the region of 30.
Which still is heavy.
It's still heavy, but 30 is, if you work some angles, is manageable and you can lift it up. So I actually only took my bags off my bike once, and consequently was, much less of a draining experience. With regards to getting lost, I sent Jude a screenshot of, well, another thing, I was following Jude's story and Jude's route. So, I mean, he was the groundbreaker on this. So I had some sense of there is a way through here. This will work. Someone has done it. And here I am with half as much kit. So lucky me, I'll find a way through. But that said, I was, and this is a good example of where phones are really useful, because I was using even if you haven't got a SIM card in your phone and it's on airplane mode, it is still a GPS device. It's not going to transmit your signal to a satellite and tell other people where you are, but it can tell you with really great accuracy, to within about 5 meters where you are. And if you have downloaded, cached maps beforehand, then it is, it is a GPS unit. And so I did that for this section because, I tried to be sensible. And there was one particular area where this is on the old abandoned route that Jude was on, a particular section, the sort of the densest, the hardest section of it, where the sort of tiny footpath that's often quite invisible that I was following, it must have split at some point. It must have branched and I must have taken the wrong tine of the fork. And I noticed on the map that I was sort of diverging from the line, because there is this faint dotted line of a sort of footpath trail. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, well, I mean, these things, the line might not be perfectly accurate. And footpaths move, I mean, in Papua New Guinea, I've experienced this a lot. There is no fixed footpath. The footpath is wherever people go, wherever people manage to get through, much like tire tracks in a desert. And I thought, well, I mean, of course you're going to diverge at times. So it'll probably come back on. And I sort of started thinking about, well, I'll see, it looks like it's bending round to the right there, whereas I've gone off to the left. So that looks like it'll probably come back on. And I carried on maybe half an hour. I realized I'm definitely off the trail. But it looks like the trail in a wider sense does loop all the way back around. And if I keep going straight, I've probably just taken, by this point, I wasn't really even on trail anymore. I was just kind of muscling my way through the jungle.
Hacking your way through, yeah.
Exactly. And if I keep going, and it was quite steep, it was hilly. If I keep going, essentially I would have just done a really hard shortcut, and great, I'll get back onto it. So I kept on doing that, but then it's just, and I've had this before in various places, particularly in jungles. Jungles are disorientating and claustrophobic because you think you're turning right, but then just the location of a tree forces you to turn slightly left to get around it, and you never quite recorrect. So then you're slightly off path, and then another thing does that, and there's a sort of particularly dense bush there I can't get through. And eventually you realize, I've veered off and I'm facing 90 degrees in a different direction. And so I kind of checked in every 5-10 minutes on my map, and I saw that I was just diverging further and further and further away, and never quite getting back on. And eventually, I think I'm massively cynical with many things in life and a huge skeptic, but I'm also one of life's optimists.
You have to be to have done what you've done. Like, seriously, I don't think you could do what you do if you weren't optimistic in some measure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just a kind of a faith in, it's not a faith in providence or anything like that, but just in kind of luck. If you keep plugging away, something will work out eventually. And so I thought, I'll get there eventually. I don't want to turn back and just go back in the same direction. And I stuck with that until I realized I had gone in an entire circle and had come across my trail again. And at that point I thought, I should probably just turn up the trail I came down and get back to the branch wherever it was that I went wrong. So I did that, and ultimately it was a couple of hours wasted and not the end of the world. How I felt when that was happening, never really a problem, because I had enough food. I was in the jungle. It was easy to find water in the jungle. I never felt sort of, threatened. I just felt a bit kind of irritated and exasperated, which is, I think those are good things to feel from time to time. So it wasn't really a problem. There have been times in the past where I've got lost in a similar sense and have felt over the course of not, a couple of hours, but several hours, a rising sense of not despair, but self-doubt, I would say. Thankfully, in the Gola Forest on this particular occasion, and there were a couple other times where I lost the trail and eventually managed to pick it up again, but that one I've mentioned was probably the worst example. there have been times where I've found it a more impactful experience, perhaps.
It sort of makes me think to a point that we talked about earlier of, again, the experiences that you've built up over time that even whether you're reflecting on it in the moment or not, I don't think it matters. It's just that inner resilience that you've built up. It's experience. You've gone through something. And I was wondering, actually, how did the Gola, like the jungle there, compare to what you would have encountered in Papua New Guinea? Because there's some pretty thick, rugged terrain there as well that you no doubt had to make your way through as well.
The Papua New Guinean, or the New Guinean jungle is, in my experience, uniquely tough.
As an Aussie, we learn about it from like World War II and the Kokoda Trail, and I don't know if you know. You probably do.
I know of it. I haven't walked it.
It's meant to be brutal, and
yeah. Well, the thing about the Kokoda Trail nowadays is it is a trail.
Yes, it wasn't then. No.
Well, exactly. Yeah, and when they did it, it was this incredible, story of resilience and accomplishment. Nowadays, it's something that. Well, I mean, Rob Lilwall, are you aware of him? He cycled through Siberia with Al. This is 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Lives in Singapore, I think. I mean, Rob dragged his bike along the Kokoda Trail because it's a trail and you can do it. And people do hike it. I believe that occasionally, an office team from corporate Australia will
I've
fly
worked
up
in
there
corporate Australia that has sent office teams there. There you go.
Well, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge.
I should clarify, it's a challenge and I'm absolutely all for that.
But it's achievable.
Exactly. And I would love to do it. And one day maybe I will. The sort of experiences in New Guinea that I found particularly challenging are the places where it's only a trail in the sense that someone has walked on it a bit, at some point. So it's a very vague hunting trail up extremely steep hills. And the first time I hiked in Papua New Guinea was in the Finisterre Range, which is sort of just north of Leh in the east of the country. It's a sort of a branch. It's a range apart from the highlands.
Suggests the end of the world there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a valley that cuts it off from the main highlands, so it's right on the coast, and yet it has soaring peaks up to a little over 4,000 meters. And I was trying to get up a mountain, and I took two guys, I hired two guys to come with me from the village at the base of the mountain. And we spent a week. You go up 1,000 meters over the top and then descend 900 meters. And it was during the monsoon, so cross a rushing river and then go up another 1,200 meters and then back down again.
Aren't you glad you weren't hauling a 30-kilo bike doing that?
Yeah, I know.
God.
The thing that's particularly demoralizing is you go up 1,000 meters and down 1,000 meters and you are 2 kilometers from where you set off. And yet, an entire day has passed. And so it was the monsoon when we were there. So leeches all over the place. I was I got myself some sort of sturdy, ankle-high, waterproof hiking boots. I thought that's the right thing to have. I now know better. Because waterproof means that you are just trapping all the sweat in your feet. And all the rain and sweat that sort of trickles down your legs and your body, basically it all just accumulates in your feet. So, I mean, within 4 days, my feet were starting to literally rot.
Like foot rot, yeah. Ugh.
Exactly. And I would watch with envy because it's these steep trails and an ankle boot supports your ankle, which is a disaster on these steep trails because you need the flexibility of your ankle to be able to manage. So when you're going down, you can't you can't sort of point your toe essentially to prepare your foot for stepping on a slope. So I would be slipping all over the place. I'd start falling, reach out, grab the first thing you can to steady yourself, which is invariably a vine covered in thorns. Everything is spiky. And while it's from a nature perspective, not the most hostile jungle in that there is not really dangerous fauna. I mean, there are big sort of feral, wild pigs like you have in parts of Australia that, that can get very, very big, very, very dangerous. There are cassowaries that can kill a child on a bad day, but there's not, and there are poisonous things, but it's not like parts of, there are other parts of the world, I think, where there's more out to kill you, and Australia, I would say is one of them.
You don't have crocodiles to deal with in the jungle there, or
no,
something. Yeah.
in down in the delta and the rivers you do, but yeah, I would watch with envy as the guys I was with, every time they stepped, their short, broad, muscular feet their toes would splay and grip the ground, and they were so perfectly attuned and adapted to their environment, acclimatized to their environment, and I was just slipping and sliding all over the place. totally dependent on them. That was the first time I went. I've since, I've been back to Papua New Guinea a couple of other times. I've hiked into other parts of the highlands. I've got better at coping and surviving with that. But frankly, I'm not a jungle person. I like mountains and deserts and steppe and open places and space. And I find the jungle oppressive. It's really, really, it's out to get you. Everything is exhausting. There is not really any sense of respite. And even when you set up your camp, there's always the chance that some sort of little snake is slithering into your camp. There's a guy I saw give a lecture in London a few months ago who took an expedition to find a type of echidna that was thought to have been extinct. And during this they found it, which is great. During this expedition, a leech got into someone's eye and went round the side of their eyeball. And this person had to be evacuated because they had a leech at the back of their eyeball. Oh. And that happened just while he was in his hammock in camp.
Sorry,
I find...
I'm literally... You can't see my face, listeners. I'm trying, it must look mental, but I'm just like, You know when someone feels someone else's pain, you get that pit in your stomach. I'm just like, my eyes just just the thought. I've had leeches before. I know what they're like. Yeah. A little bit of salt helps to get leeches off, but you wouldn't put that in
tobacco.
Your eye. Yeah. Yeah. I haven't got the experience with tobacco, but I do trust an adventurer like you, an expeditionist like you, to know the way on that. Can I go back to when you were saying? Because, quickly actually, when you were describing the jungle, to me, what feeling I get from that is almost like claustrophobia.
Exactly that.
And when you were talking about the places that you really, that bring you alive and energize you are more those open landscapes. I wanted to quickly talk about the topic of awe, because I think so much of your expedition, and you've talked about it in your book, and I'll give your books a quick shout out. Listeners, if you haven't read them, do yourself a massive favour and get them both. You can either get them in beautiful hardback, I'm sure they're on Kindle. You can do what I did just recently and listen to Charlie tell you his story, which is quite cool too. The first one is Through Sand and Snow is part 1, and On the Roads That Echo is part 2. I'll provide links in the show notes, which will direct you there. But I wanted to talk about moments of awe. In your books, you talk a lot about, feeling alone or loneliness or grappling with that inner voice or even the first book, the struggle of the why. But I want to talk about the flip side of that and the energizing part of doing things that are hard, because for sure over 4.5 years and over, almost 15 years now, you must have had some pretty incredible moments of awe where, as I've said it so many times, listeners, where Mother Nature makes you feel the size of like a tiny ant. And I'd love to just, it feels an impossible question almost, but tell me about a moment of awe.
I could, so many.
You could write a book about awe. There you go.
Yeah. There's one particular, in fact, actually, it's almost embarrassingly, there's a picture of it on the wall behind me there. This was the first really high mountain pass I made on my way up to Tibet. So this is still technically in Xinjiang province in northwest China, on my way up towards the plateau. And I'd been going, I was on a road, but a track, not sealed or anything like that. And really dusty. At times there was, it must be incredibly windless in that particular area, or maybe it was the sheltered nature of this particular valley that I was climbing through. Because often there would be 3 inches of powder fine dust, like cycling through flour, that of course immediately coats your chain and, just is annoying. And you leave this trench through it with your tyres. And if you stop, your footprints are, the dust comes over the top of your feet. It's like being in snow. And so it was hard work cycling up through that. And of course, under that, you can't necessarily see where rocks are or pitfalls. So having to push quite a lot, very steep. Essentially 2 days of going at walking pace, or slower than walking pace when I actually had to walk and push. And just plugging away, climbing. Probably it was the first pass I came to from the Xinjiang, from the desert, the fringes of the Taklamakan desert. So I probably climbed something like 4,000 meters, just up and up and up, relentless, continuous climb, 4,000 meters. And then when I came to the pass, the road went through this little cutout between 2 peaks either side of it. In this picture, you can see it. And suddenly this when you're going up a valley, you're looking forward, and occasionally you might look over your shoulder, but also the nature of valleys and spurs and the valley walls, it kind of veils things from you. But when you suddenly get to the highest point and you're treated to the vista, this panorama opened up in front of me, and it was this incredible sort of violent geological thrash of mountains, like a row of serrated shark's teeth. And geographically, it's a very interesting point. Up here, just around the corner from where I was K2 in Pakistan. I was in Xinjiang. Afghanistan was quite close by. I was just on the edge of Tibet. All these sort of often contested boundaries all tangle together in this really small part of the world. Later on this journey, I went past Lake Palgon, which is a sort of a DMZ between China and India, disputed since the 1960s. There are soldiers there on both sides, but there's a DMZ, so they don't have weapons, but periodically, every couple of years, you'll see a story in the news about fistfights, and someone gets pushed off a cliff or clubbed to death or beaten to death with rocks because the soldiers fall out, on either side and start having a fight, but they don't have any weapons, so it is brutal hand-to-hand combat with just blunt implements or cliff edges, precipice. Yeah, up here, it just felt unbelievably remote, and it was January. It was absolutely freezing. There, I hadn't seen a vehicle for a day, I think, and often, later on that trip through Tibet, I think there was at one point 4 or 5 days where I didn't see a vehicle. It was just, I felt it was the most remote I'd ever felt, and probably the most remote I had ever been. And during the 2 days of climbing and struggling and feeling exhausted and thinking, oh, what's the point in all this, and feeling lonely, suddenly you get to the top and all of that immediately just melts away. It thaws with the kind of grandeur, the humbling grandeur of this enormous view that opens up before you. And you do feel like you're on top of the world because you can see so far. And, looking out over those mountains, thinking, I don't know how many countries I'm even looking across right now. It might be 2, it might be 3. I have no idea, because it's just, and of course I didn't have a phone and maps or anything to tell me that. That was, I think, a huge moment of awe. And then relatively short-lived, because the way down was just as hard as the way up. And, I think I came off a couple of times. It was very bumpy.
I think the way down can be harder.
I used to only think that with cycling. But now I think that with walking as well, because I'm getting older and my knees hurt on the way down.
As you get older, Charlie, it gets worse.
Oh, I'm aware.
Oh, what a moment. Listeners, this is an audio podcast. I don't have the video there for you to see. And I hope this doesn't sound weird, Charlie, but just you talking about it visually on your face, I could just see you just energized. Just like, and there's obviously this memory recall. There's this feeling that you get just remembering those moments. Do you ever do that? Do you ever take yourself back to moments? Do you ever, something triggers a memory and puts you in that space? As opposed to the struggle moments, which I'm sure everyone wants to always talk about, but there's happy moments that happen on these times as well, I
do from time to time, and often they catch me unawares. And this relates slightly to what we were talking about before we started recording, but because I'm a storyteller for a living and I speak to audiences about my journeys, because speaking, in a 30-minute slot, a 40-minute slot, a 20-minute slot, whatever it might be, by default, you have to compress what you're talking about and be really selective. So inevitably, it ends up tending to be the same sort of, not always, and because I never write talks, I get very tangential. I'm a bit of a rambler. Inevitably, you tend towards the same sort of, superlative moments, be they high moments or low moments. And so those are, I revisit those time and time again, and also frequently strive to literally revisit them in my diary from that day to make sure that I'm not, or at least not overly simplifying or shaving the edges off these things, because as we discussed before recording, you have memories and then you have memories of memories. And some people theorize that every time you retell something or remember something, it's a photocopy of a photocopy, and it's becoming, a facsimile rather than, the verity is slowly smoothed out of the image or the memory. So yeah, I do have those. But then going back to moments of awe, there's one particular sort of, I'm not going to say time, but moment that I constantly go back to. And I think this is kind of my fondest memory from all of my journeys, and this is a recurring memory, and it basically involves setting up camp in a big open empty place. And it's the sense of, I mean, very selfishly, it's the sense of having a landscape to yourself. I'm the only person in this valley, on this desert plain, or whatever it might be, and the graft for the day is done. I have finished. I can relax. You drop your defenses. This is something you don't in the same way get in the jungle, because there's not the same sense of space. I mean, I've hung my hammock in the jungle and I've climbed inside and zipped it up and felt, I'm kind of relaxed, but still then the noise strikes up and everything is quite oppressive. But if you're in some big open, in a valley in Kazakhstan, or in a desert, or in a mountain, you always pick the best spots to camp at, even if it means cycling less than you intended that day. So to me, it's really important. Pick a beautiful spot. You don't want to be sleeping in a waste dump on the outskirts of a town. Inevitably, that happens sometimes. But that sense of finishing the day, putting up your tent, feeling a sense of achievement and satisfaction that I've done what I needed to do today. And then all the good things come. The food comes, the lying back, particularly when you finish eating. If you're like me, you never remember to bring a camping chair. So your meal is taken hunched over like a feral creature on the ground, just scramming things into your mouth.
I can't see you on a camping chair.
No, well, I keep meaning to take one. But finally you finish, you lie back flat, you feel replete, you've got food in you. You can read a book or just stare out. If it's dry and you don't need a tent and there's no insects, you get this sense even more, because you've got that insane sense of space, the world's biggest bedroom. And then the world's most incredible, night sky starts to speckle into existence above you, and just all the pieces align. That sense, which I've had dozens of times in dozens of different parts of the world, that's my favorite thing about, and it's weird because it's a very solitary thing. That is my favorite thing about traveling by myself. That is for me, in some sense, the grail, because it's pure, selfish, peaceful bliss with nothing to do until you've had 9 hours of sleep. It's such a privilege. That is not in a nutshell why I travel, but that is definitely one of my favorite things about expeditions, because it's simple and it's beautiful.
Which is at totally the other end of the spectrum to the first story we were talking about at the start of that 2-week trip with a broken wrist, and it was so hard, and it was just, and you fell over on it and you broke it again and it was terrible, but some reason that's the other end of the spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah, although I think I know I had that sense during that journey, at least on a couple of occasions.
That's why you had the rose-tinted glasses.
Well, exactly. However hard the day is, when the day is over, that's great. There's that phrase, which I think is incorrect, but the night is always darkest just before the dawn, which isn't true because the light starts to bleed in and whatever. But I think, anyway.
It's always coldest just after the sun has risen.
Yeah, yes. But metaphorically, both of these things make absolute sense to me. Or metaphorically, they make sense. Literally, perhaps less so. I don't know.
Yes. You're right. Oh gosh, Charlie, I have to wind things up. I don't want to. I could talk to you for days. In fact, I really hope to meet you face to face one day, buy you a drink, and just have you talk to me. That'd be a change. You don't get asked questions, you just get to speak. Although, by the sounds of it, you don't like doing that.
No. I mean, if and let's say when we meet for a drink, the tables are turned, and then I'm just firing questions at you.
I'll go for it. I can tell you. I'll tell you what I've learnt from interviewing people like you for the last few years. I do have 3 very quick questions to wrap the show up with. The first one's music related. You're a guest of the Seek Travel Ride podcast, which means you get to pick a song to go on the Seek Travel Ride music playlist. Every song on there has been picked by a guest, and it's the song that they've chosen to be the soundtrack to their adventures. What song are you picking, Charlie Walker?
Oh, I thought long and hard about this over my coffee this morning.
Oh, I love it.
I hope it's not on your list already, but it's You're the Voice by John Farnham, who is an Australian.
I grew up on this. Fancy.
I mean, it's a nuclear disarmament protest song released just before I was born. But yes, that I would have to have on there. I listened to
You're
that
the voice, try
a lot.
It.
Exactly that, in good and bad times.
I'm going to cut that bit out.
For copyright purposes, of course.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, because I sung one bar of that in tune. All right, You're the Voice by Farnsey, John Farnham. Oh, I love it. Proud to have an Aussie on the list. And listeners, as you know, the music playlist is there on Spotify and Apple. I got locked out of this on Spotify about 3 months ago, which means the original playlist couldn't get added to, so make sure you seek out the full collection and you'll get over 6 hours of eclectic beats. All right, Charlie, next question. You will have had personal experience doing both, so it's going to be interesting to see what you're going to choose. You're given a choice one day. You can go left, and going left means you're going to be on the most bumpiest corrugated washboard road in the world. The roughest thing, there's no reprieve, there's no smooth to it. You can go the other direction, and you're going to face a brutal, never-ending headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
Yeah, I've heard you ask other people this question, and it's a horrific question. But it's left.
You're taking the corrugations.
Yeah, I love hard roads. When I heard about the Gola Rainforest route, for example, I thought, yeah, I really want to do that. And I thought about it more. I thought, I don't really want to do that. And then I realized because I don't want to do it, I do have to do it. So the masochist in me is turning left. There is no element of masochism in me that wants to turn right into a headwind. I've cycled both ways across the Sahara, down the east across Sudan and then up the other side. And the other side, I had for about 2 weeks, the most blistering headwind. The headwind that was pushing Rob McLennan, for example, 200 miles in a day or whatever it was. That had me going at 6 kilometers an hour for 2 weeks. And I would cycle in the night where I'd maybe get myself to 8 kilometers an hour because the winds were slightly less.
I don't know how people do it. And it's like people who go north from Ushuaia, going north up through Patagonia. I think Patagonia, from what I've experienced, from what I've interviewed with people, I think that's got the worst reputation for most brutal winds in the world.
Well, they'd be cold down there as well.
Yeah, but some people set off from there and they've got like literally a month of, at best 5 kilometres an hour. And then where do you pitch your tent? Because like if it's raging, there are some strong, resilient people there.
Headwinds strip away, they blow away the ability to even think clearly.
Or hear. You can't even hear your thoughts.
Exactly. And there's a bit like being in extreme cold, which is why cold and headwinds together is especially bad. But there is a sense with a headwind of just you're on edge. You're kind of almost on the edge of panic because you're hunched into it. There's no space to relax. It's the most relentless thing, very literally. Yeah, so that's not for me. I am a masochist. I love type 2 fun. I've never looked back with rose-tinted lenses at that time in the Sahara.
No. All right. Okay, team corrugation. Final question. I want you to just finish this sentence for me. And it's a simple sentence, but it always has a unique answer. The best thing about taking a bike adventure is?
Different answers at different points in my life. I would say the ability to affordably go anywhere forcibly slowly. It's cheap, it's slow, and it forces you to go to all the places in between.
The places in between. Though never knew existed towns.
The Tanzanian Singidas of this world. Exactly, yeah.
Oh, I love it. And in that full circle moment, Charlie Walker, what an absolute pleasure. I knew before I got into this session I was going to be energised after this call, just listening to someone who's taken adventures and expeditions like you share your experiences. Listeners, I am sure you are the same. I know that there's many more to come, and I certainly hope to share a drink with you at some stage in the future. I wish you many, many moments of awe, of that satisfaction of not having to do a single thing for hours, having set up tent with the best vista, quiet, peace, eating your meal. Maybe you've brought a camp chair with you. Either way, it's been an absolute pleasure. Charlie Walker, thank you so, so much for sharing your stories and experiences here on the podcast for Seek Travel Ride.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And listeners, there we have it. What a discussion I had there with Charlie. I knew before pressing record the stories that he would tell me would be quite gripping. And also I could just tell from the wisdom and, dare I say it, the experience that he recounted them with, how it's pretty clear to me that with each evolution of his journey, with each day, week, month and year of his expeditions, just that experience helped him. The knowledge, the self-assuredness that he could get through certain situations, that I guess in a way he also chooses to seek out certain situations, to go through those struggles, ultimately maybe to be able to set up his tent in those moments of awe as well. I really loved chatting with Charlie there. I am sure I could probably speak to him quite comfortably for weeks and still not hear all the tales he would share. And I hope that you enjoyed what we discussed there today. Again, I 100% encourage you to go and seek out his books. They are incredible reading or listening if you like me and you like your book's audio format as well. And yeah, I hope that he's also maybe given you that little bit of inspiration to potentially seek out those moments of awe in your own adventures as well. Now, listeners, if you have been enjoying what you've been tuning into here on Seek, Travel, Ride, one of the best things you can do to help this podcaster out is to actually share this show with your friends and family. If you are into bike adventures or just adventures full stop, the chances are pretty high that you also hang with people who are exactly the same. Word of mouth is one of the best ways to help continue to grow the podcast. It has a truly global audience being listened to in 180 countries all around the world. If you've listened to an episode that you've especially loved, please take the time to share that and tell someone why they too would enjoy listening to Seek, Travel, Ride and help me grow this community even more. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening. And before you go, don't forget, Beyond the Bike is happening soon in London on May 14 and 15. It's going to be an incredible night of stories, film, and adventure cycling insights with some of the most inspiring guests from the podcast. Tickets are available now, but they're not going to last. So head to the link in the show notes, grab yours, come to one night, or if you're a super fan, come to both. Grab your ticket before they're gone, and I hope to see you there. Before you go, just another shout out to our show sponsor, Old Man Mountain, and their new hemlock bags with flip cages. They're fork-mounted packs which will attach securely with a hook and lever flip, ensuring a stable, rattle-free ride and easy removal. They're built for durability, they're ideal for your bikepacking adventures. Check them out at our custom link, oldmanmountain.com/seek travel ride, or simply click the link in the show notes. Happy riding!